The microphone was already live when my mother took it from Britt's hand and said, loud enough for all 200 guests to hear, "Well, we all know Reagan's used to being in the background. My name is Reagan, I'm 33, and I want to tell you that I laughed along with the room that night, because for a few terrible seconds, that's exactly what I did, laughed, the way you laugh when your body hasn't caught up to what your ears just heard. I'm an ER nurse, a senior charge nurse now, though the promotion had only come through 6 weeks earlier, something I hadn't even told my family yet because I'd learned, over the years, that good news of mine tended to get absorbed into the room without comment, the way water disappears into dry soil. I work in a trauma bay where I've held pressure on wounds that would make most people faint, where I've told a mother her son didn't make it and then gone back out to triage the next patient 40 minutes later. I am, by every professional measure, someone who does not fall apart in public. That night, at my younger sister Britt's wedding, in a ballroom my parents had spent more on than they'd spent on my entire childhood combined, I came very close to falling apart in public anyway. I need to back up, because the toast didn't come from nowhere, nothing in my family ever does, even when it looks spontaneous. I have a 5-year-old son, Caleb, who was sitting beside me at table 23, which was, I'd noticed when I checked the seating chart 3 weeks earlier, positioned directly beside the kitchen doors. I'd told myself that was a logistics thing. 200 guests, somebody has to sit near the kitchen. I am good, it turns out, at telling myself things. Caleb was wearing a little navy suit jacket I'd found on sale, his hair combed the way he liked it, swinging his legs under the table because the band hadn't started yet and he was bored the specific, restless way 5-year-olds get bored. He looked up at me right as my mother took the microphone, his face bright with the easy trust kids have that nothing bad is about to happen in a room full of grown-ups in nice clothes. I want you to understand what happened before I tell you what happened, because I think it matters. My family, the version of it I'd carried in my head for 33 years, was never cruel in an obvious, easy-to-name way. It was warm on the surface, at Christmas, in photographs, in the stories my mother told at parties about her girls. I'd spent my whole life believing that warmth was real, because most of the time, from a certain angle, it looked exactly like love. I wasn't naive. I want to be clear about that. I was hopeful, which is a very different thing, and I didn't understand yet how much that hope had cost me. My mother, Colleen, had the microphone in one hand and a glass of champagne in the other, and she was smiling the smile she saved for cameras. I just want to say, she said, how proud we are of Britt tonight. She's found someone who actually wants to be with her. A small laugh rippled through the crowd, the kind that assumes a joke is coming, the safe kind, which, honestly, in this family, feels like a small miracle. I felt Caleb's hand find mine under the table before I even registered why I needed it. Reagan, my mother continued, turning slightly, finding me at table 23 with the practiced ease of someone who'd rehearsed exactly where to look. You know I love you, sweetheart, but we all know you're used to standing on the sidelines. Single mom, works all the holidays, never quite, she paused, just long enough, the way a good performer knows how to pause, finish the picture, if you know what I mean. The room laughed. Not everyone. But enough people that the sound of it filled the ballroom the way water fills a low place in the ground, finding every gap. I remember, with a clarity that still makes my chest tighten, that Caleb looked up at me in that laughter and asked, in the too loud voice of a 5-year-old who hasn't learned yet that some questions aren't meant to be asked out loud, "Mommy, why is everyone laughing at you?" I didn't have an answer for him. I smiled instead, the smile I'd been perfecting since I was maybe 8 years old, the one that says everything's fine even when the person wearing it has gone somewhere very far away inside herself. Britt was standing beside my mother in her $12,000 dress, and I watched her face carefully in that moment, because some small, stubborn part of me was still hoping she'd step in, still hoping the sister I used to build blanket forts with might, even now, even here, choose me over the moment. She didn't step in. She leaned toward the microphone, and with a little laugh of her own, added, "Don't worry, Reagan, we still love you, even if you're kind of," she made a small gesture, a little half-shrug that somehow said more than words, used product at this point, right? The laughter that followed that line was different from the first one. Sharper. A few people didn't laugh at all. I caught, in the corner of my vision, my Aunt Denise's hand rising to cover her mouth, not in amusement but in something closer to horror. I sat there with my son's small hand in mine, in front of 200 people, and I would learn the next morning, a live stream that had been running the entire time for relatives who couldn't attend, and I felt something in me go very quiet and very still. Not the stillness of shock exactly, though there was some of that too, but something underneath it, older, that had been waiting a long time for a moment exactly like this one to finally make itself known. I didn't know it yet, but the worst thing that happened at that wedding wasn't going to be the joke. It was going to be what came 30 seconds later, when someone I'd never expected to say a single word in my defense stood up from his seat at the head table and picked up his own microphone. I have to take you back 6 weeks, to before any of this, because I think you need to understand what my life actually looked like before that ballroom, or none of what follows will mean what it's supposed to mean. 6 weeks before the wedding, I was mostly just tired in the specific way single mothers who work 12-hour shifts are tired, a tiredness that's less about sleep and more about never quite getting to put your own needs down anywhere. I'd just been promoted to senior charge nurse, which came with a raise I badly needed and a level of responsibility I'd worked toward for 4 years. I remember standing in the hospital parking garage the day I got the news, calling my mother before I even called Hannah, my best friend since nursing school, because some part of me still hadn't given up on the idea that this might be the thing that finally registered with her. "That's nice, honey," my mother said, and then, within the same breath, "Did you hear Britt and Julian settled on the venue? The Ashford Hotel. $12,000 for the ballroom alone, can you imagine?" I could imagine it, actually, better than she knew, because I'd priced out venues myself once, 3 years earlier, for a wedding to Caleb's father, Trevor, that never happened, a story I don't often tell, because it ends with Trevor deciding, for months before the date, that he wasn't ready to be anyone's husband, only about 6 weeks after finding out I was pregnant. I raised that memory and set it back down. I'd gotten good, over the years, at doing that quickly, efficiently, the way I'd trained myself to compartmentalize things at work that would otherwise follow me home. I want to reference something about my job here, because it shaped how I saw everything that spring without my quite realizing it. In the ER, you learn to read a room in about 4 seconds, who's actually in danger, who's performing distress, who's minimizing something serious because they don't want to be a burden. I'd developed, over 8 years of trauma nursing, an instinct for the gap between what people say is wrong and what's actually wrong. I just hadn't yet turned that instinct on my own family, because some part of me had always kept my professional I and my daughter I in 2 separate rooms, refusing to let them talk to each other. That spring, they started talking to each other anyway. It started small. My mother texting me, 3 weeks before the wedding, about the dress code, "Nothing too flashy, sweetheart, this is Britt's day," a sentence that on its own meant nothing, except that I'd been planning to wear a simple navy dress I already owned, and the comment landed with a specificity that made me feel, for the first time, like she'd already pictured exactly what I might wear and preemptively shrunk it. Then came the seating chart conversation. I'd asked, casually, where Caleb and I would be sitting, mostly so I could plan around his bedtime, and my mother had said, a little too quickly, "Oh, we're still finalizing that, don't worry about it," in a tone that made me notice, really notice, the way you notice a smell that's slightly wrong in a room you know well, that she hadn't actually answered the question. I remember mentioning this to Hannah over coffee, and her saying, "That's weird, right? Ask again." "It's probably nothing," I said. "It's a huge wedding. Logistics are complicated." I want to pause here, because I think some of you already know this specific shape of denial, the one where you can feel something is off, actually feel it, in your body, and you talk yourself back down anyway, not because you don't trust your own instincts, but because trusting them means admitting something you're not ready to admit. I'd spent 33 years building a version of my family that I could live inside comfortably. Admitting that version might be wrong felt, in that moment, like a bigger threat than whatever the seating chart actually said. There was a night, about a month before the wedding, when I stopped by my parents' house to drop off a gift I'd found for Britt's bridal shower, and I saw my mother's phone light up on the kitchen counter with a notification, just a flash, the way notifications do, from something called Voss Family, no Reagan. I saw it for maybe a second and a half before the screen went dark again. I stood there in my parents' kitchen holding a gift bag, and I felt something cold slide down through my chest, fast, the way it does when your body understands something before your mind has caught up to file it properly. "Everything okay?" my mother asked, glancing up from the stove. "Yeah," I said. "Just tired." I didn't ask about the group chat. I want to be honest with you about why. Some part of me was afraid that if I asked, I'd get an answer that would make it impossible to keep pretending everything was fine, and I needed, right then, for everything to still be fine. Because Britt's wedding was 3 weeks away and I'd already RSVP'd for both myself and Caleb, and I didn't know what I would do with a version of my family that had a chat group with my name explicitly carved out of it. I drove home that night with Caleb asleep in his car seat, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel harder than the empty road required. I didn't know it yet, but that half-second glimpse of a phone screen wasn't the last thing I'd see that spring that I wasn't supposed to see. There was something else waiting, closer to the wedding than I understood, that would make the group chat feel almost gentle by comparison. 2 weeks before the wedding, I drove Caleb to his final dress rehearsal fitting for his role as a groomsman's junior escort, a small, sweet responsibility Julian had specifically asked him to take on, which had meant more to me than I probably let on, because it was one of the only moments in the entire wedding planning process where someone had gone out of their way to include my son rather than merely tolerate his presence. While Caleb was being fitted, I sat in the lobby of the tailor's shop, and Britt called me, an actual phone call, which was rare enough on its own to catch my attention. "Hey," she said, and something in her voice was off, too bright, the specific brightness people use when they're covering for something underneath it. "I just wanted to check, you're doing okay with everything? With the wedding, I mean. I know it's probably a lot, given, you know." "Given what?" I asked. "Nothing, just Trevor and everything. I know weddings can be hard when your own didn't." She stopped herself. "Sorry. That came out wrong." It had, and it hadn't. I sat with that phone call for a long time after we hung up, turning it over. It felt less like concern and more like a kind of advance apology, the sort you offer someone before you do something you already know will hurt them, so that later you can say you tried to warn them. I called Hannah that night. "Something's happening," I said. "I don't know what, but Britt just called me to basically ask if I'm emotionally prepared for something, and I don't know what that something is. Do you want me to look into the group chat thing?" Hannah asked. She'd been the one, weeks earlier, who first suggested that Voss Family, no Reagan, wasn't a typo I'd misread in a half-second glance. "I'm still friends with your cousin Sam on Instagram. He might know something." I said yes, and I want to be honest that saying yes felt like a betrayal of my own family, in a way that surprised me with its intensity. I'd spent my whole life protecting them from outside judgment, smoothing over my father's silences at gatherings, defending my mother's sharp comments as just her sense of humor to boyfriends who found her cold. Asking Hannah to quietly investigate felt like the first crack in that protective instinct, and it scared me more than the group chat itself did. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever spent years being the one who explains away your own family's behavior to the people who love you, you know exactly what that particular fear feels like. Not fear of the truth. Fear of what it will cost you to finally let yourself see it. Hannah called back 2 days later. "Sam says there's definitely a chat," she said carefully. "He's not totally sure what's in it. But he mentioned Reagan. He mentioned there's some kind of toast being planned. Like, a bit. A joke, for the reception." "A joke about what?" He didn't say. He got weird about it and changed the subject. I sat with that information the way you sit with an X-ray that shows something you can't quite read yet, aware that it means something, unable yet to name exactly what. My profession gave me an advantage here that I didn't fully appreciate until much later. 8 years of reading rooms for the gap between what's said and what's true had made me unusually attuned to my mother's specific tells, the ones I'd normally have excused as just her personality. In the 2 weeks before the wedding, I started actually watching her instead of just absorbing her. I noticed she'd started ending our phone calls faster than usual, a habit break I might have missed in someone I paid less attention to. I noticed that when I mentioned, once, that I was looking forward to the toasts, her hand had gone still on the counter for just a half-second too long before she said, brightly, "Oh, I'm sure they'll be lovely," in a tone that didn't match the pause that preceded it. I noticed, too, that my father had started avoiding being alone with me in any room. Not dramatically. Just, he'd find a reason to leave when it was down to the two of us, a habit so subtle I almost didn't register it as a pattern until the third or fourth time it happened. I told myself, again and again, that I was overreacting. That grief about Trevor and the wedding that never happened was bleeding into paranoia about a wedding that had nothing to do with me. That's the questionable decision I have to own here, if I'm honest. I had real information, a hidden group chat, a mentioned bit for the reception, a sister's strange pre-apology, and I chose, repeatedly, not to confront anyone directly. I told myself I was being gracious. Really, I think I was terrified of what confronting them might force me to admit about the last 33 years. The accidental catalyst arrived 4 days before the wedding, and it didn't come from snooping, it came from Miss Averill, my elderly neighbor, who'd been invited to the wedding decades ago as an old family friend and who stopped me in the hallway of my building to say, with the particular bluntness only very old women seem to have earned the right to, "I hope you're not too sensitive, dear. Your mother was telling me at Bridge Club there's a fun little roast planned for you at the reception. Sounds like they've all been looking forward to it." I stood in my own hallway, keys in hand, and felt the floor tilt very slightly under me. "A roast," I repeated. "Oh, you know families," Miss Averill said, already moving toward her own door. "All in good fun, I'm sure." I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in bed with my heart doing something I recognized professionally, a shallow, quick rhythm I've measured in patients experiencing acute anxiety, and I thought about walking into that wedding in 4 days with Caleb beside me, having no idea what roast actually meant, or how far it would go, or whether anyone in that family had thought, even once, about what it would do to a 5-year-old to watch his mother be the punchline. I didn't know it yet, but "all in good fun" was not a phrase anyone in my family had earned the right to use. I did something in the 3 days before the wedding that I'm still not entirely sure was the right call, though I've made a kind of peace with it since. I asked Hannah to keep digging, and this time, Sam actually sent her something, not the full chat, he wasn't willing to go that far, but a single screenshot, blurry, clearly taken in a hurry, of a message from my mother. "Britt's got the used product line ready. I'll do the setup about her being on the sidelines. We'll keep it light so it doesn't look mean. Dad, you just laugh at the right spot." I read that message standing in my own kitchen at 11 at night, Caleb asleep down the hall, and something in me went very cold and very clear, the specific clarity that arrives right before a decision gets made whether you're ready for it or not. I want to be honest about what I almost did next, because it's the part of this I still think about. I almost called my mother right then, at 11 at night, and read that screenshot back to her word for word. I got as far as opening our text thread, my thumb hovering over the call button, before I stopped myself. I understood, standing there, that if I confronted her now, 3 days before the wedding, with no one else present, nothing but a blurry screenshot from a cousin who'd deny sending it the moment things got serious, she would simply deny it, soften it, tell me I'd misunderstood a joke that was never meant to hurt me, and I'd walk into that ballroom in 3 days having gotten nothing except an early warning she'd used to control the narrative before anyone else ever saw it. So I didn't call. I saved the screenshot in 3 separate places. I told Hannah to be at the wedding, seated where she could see the head table clearly, with her phone ready. And then I did the hardest thing of the entire 3 days. I kept planning Caleb's outfit, kept RSVPing to Britt's shower thank you texts, kept behaving, outwardly, exactly like a sister who had no idea what was coming. That decision cost me something I hadn't expected. 2 days before the wedding, my mother called to go over final details, and near the end of the call, almost as an aside, she said, "I heard you might not come to the rehearsal dinner. Everything okay? You've seemed distant lately." I felt the accusation land somewhere soft, because it wasn't entirely wrong. I had been distant, though not for the reason she was implying, and some part of me wanted, badly, to defend myself, to explain that I wasn't being cold. I was protecting something. I didn't. I said, just work's been a lot. I'll be there Saturday. I let her believe, for 2 more days, that I was simply tired, rather than a woman quietly holding evidence of her own upcoming humiliation. It was during this same window that I learned something about my family's history that reframed everything I thought I understood about why this was happening now, specifically to me, specifically at Britt's wedding. I called my Aunt Denise, ostensibly to ask about a family recipe for the rehearsal dinner, but really because some instinct told me she might know something. 2 glasses of wine into the conversation, she said something I'd never heard before. You know, your mother did something almost exactly like this to me, at my own wedding, 30 years ago. Stood up and made a joke about my weight in front of everyone. Your grandmother laughed right along with her. I didn't speak to your mother for almost 2 years after that. I sat with the phone against my ear, stunned into silence. Why didn't anyone ever tell me? I finally asked. Because it worked, Denise said quietly. Because I forgave her, eventually, the way you're taught to forgive family, and once I forgave her, it was like it never happened. That's the thing about your mother, sweetheart. She's not improvising. She's done this before. I hung up the phone and sat very still in my apartment, feeling something shift permanently in how I understood the woman who raised me. This wasn't a spontaneous cruelty born of stress or a bad week. It was a pattern, one with a history that predated me entirely, one my own aunt had survived and quietly buried rather than warn the next generation about. The second thing I learned came the night before the wedding, from Britt herself, though she didn't mean to tell me. I'd stopped by her hotel room to drop off something for the morning, and I found her on the phone with Julian, unaware I'd let myself in with the door propped for deliveries. I heard just enough before she noticed me. I told him it's not that big a deal, it's just a joke. Reagan's tough, she can handle it. I'm not trying to be cruel, I don't want Mom mad at me the week of my own wedding. She hung up fast when she saw me, her face rearranging itself half a second too late into a bright, unbothered smile. Hey. Just going over last-minute stuff with Julian. I didn't say anything. I handed her the garment bag she'd asked for and left. But the phrase stayed lodged in me the whole drive home. I don't want Mom mad at me the week of my own wedding. Not conviction. Not cruelty, even, exactly. Just the calculation of someone choosing the path of least resistance, at my expense, because it was easier than being the one person in the room who said no. I didn't sleep the night before the wedding. I lay awake with Caleb's little suit hanging pressed on the closet door, and I thought about Denise's words, she's done this before, and I thought, too, about Julian, who I barely knew, who had spent 2 years watching my family from the outside with, I would soon learn, considerably clearer eyes than any of us who'd grown up inside it. I didn't know it yet, but the screenshot in my bag wasn't going to be the only thing that exposed my family that night. There was someone else at that wedding who had been quietly gathering his own evidence, for entirely different reasons, and his timing would matter more than mine. The morning of the wedding, I woke at 5 without an alarm, my heart already moving faster than it should have for 6 a.m. I hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days. My hands, buttoning Caleb's little jacket, were not quite steady. I called Hannah before we left. Today's the day, I said. Remember the phone ready, and stay close to the head table if you can. I've got it, she said. Reagan, whatever happens, you're not crazy. You know that, right? I didn't fully believe her yet. I would, by the end of the night. Everything went smoothly for the first 2 hours, the ceremony, the receiving line, the dinner service. I sat at table 23 with Caleb, near the kitchen doors, and I watched my mother work the room with the specific warmth she reserved for public occasions, and some small part of me, even with the screenshot burning a hole in my bag, still hoped, irrationally, that maybe it wouldn't happen after all. Maybe someone had talked her out of it. Maybe I'd overreacted to a message I hadn't fully understood. Then the toasts began. I've already told you what happened in that first minute, the microphone used to being in the background, the laughter, Caleb's small confused question, Britt's used product line landing like something physical in my chest. I sat there with my son's hand in mine, and for those first 30 seconds, I genuinely didn't know what I was going to do. My body had gone into the same still, watchful state I recognize from the worst moments in the ER, the state where everything slows down and your training takes over before your emotions catch up. I was reaching for my phone, not to record anything, just to have something to hold on to, when Julian stood up. I want to describe this carefully, because it happened fast, and because it was the single moment I least expected in the entire night. Julian, Britt's new husband, a family law attorney I'd exchanged maybe a dozen sentences with across 2 years of engagement dinners, picked up his own microphone from the head table, and the room, sensing something shifting, went quiet in that particular way a room goes quiet when it senses the script has just been abandoned. I need to say something, he said, and I need everyone to actually listen, because I don't think most of you understood what you just laughed at. My mother's smile, beside him, faltered for the first time all evening. I've spent 2 years getting to know this family, Julian continued, and in that time, I've watched Reagan get quietly written out of every version of this story that gets told. I've heard about the seating chart discussions. I've heard about the joke that was planned for tonight, weeks in advance, in a group chat that specifically excludes her by name. I've watched a woman who works trauma shifts, who raised her son essentially alone, who has shown up to every single family event for this wedding without complaint, get mocked, on her own family's stage, in front of her 5-year-old. The silence in that ballroom had a texture to it I don't think I'll ever forget. Julian, my mother said, her voice sharpening instantly into something defensive, this is not the time. It's exactly the time, Julian said, because in about 30 seconds, everyone in this room is going to go back to eating cake and pretending this was a lighthearted joke, and I'm not willing to let that happen. This was my moment, and some steady part of me finally understood that I didn't need to be the one to open with the evidence. Julian had already cracked the room open. What I could do was close it. I stood up slowly, Caleb's hand still in mine, and I walked to where Hannah was standing near the head table, and I took my phone from her, the screenshot already pulled up on the screen, and I held it up, not shouting, not performing, just steady. This was sent 4 days ago, I said, my voice carrying further than I expected in the sudden quiet. Britt's got the used product line ready, I'll do the setup about her being on the sidelines. We'll keep it light so it doesn't look mean, Dad, you just laugh at the right spot. I looked at my mother. You didn't improvise that tonight. You planned it. In a group chat you named after excluding me. 200 faces turned toward my mother, and I watched, in real time, the specific unraveling of someone who has built her entire identity around controlling how a room perceives her. That's taken out of context, she said, too fast, too loud. You don't understand family humor, Reagan, you never have, you've always been so sensitive? I offered. Is that the word you're reaching for? My father, beside her, said nothing at all, which I noted with a clarity that felt, in that moment, almost as damning as the joke itself. Britt, who had gone pale under her makeup, finally spoke, and it wasn't in her mother's defense. Mom, she said quietly, I told Julian it wasn't a big deal. I said that. I own that. Her voice cracked. But I didn't write the group chat name. That was you. I just went along with it because I didn't want you upset with me during my own wedding week. Aunt Denise, seated near the back, stood up slowly, and though she didn't speak, the look she gave my mother across that ballroom said more than words could have. 30 years of a private wound, finally acknowledged in public, whether Colleen wanted it to be or not. She's done this before, I said, quietly enough that only the people closest to me heard it, though I meant for my mother to hear it most. Ask Denise about her own wedding sometime. My mother's face moved through something ugly and fast, rage first, sharp and immediate, aimed at me for having proof rather than at herself for having earned the accusation. You've been recording us? Spying on your own family? I've been paying attention, I said. For the first time in 33 years, I've actually been paying attention. Julian, still holding the microphone, looked at my mother with something that had curdled entirely from the polite, patient warmth he'd shown her for 2 years. I think, he said slowly, I need everyone to understand that I'm not going to be marrying into a family that treats people this way. Britt, I love you. But I watched you go along with this, tonight, in front of her son, and I need you to understand what that tells me about what our marriage would actually look like. The gasp that moved through the ballroom at that was audible, physical, a single collective intake of breath. My mother's rage cracked, over the following minute, into something closer to panic, the specific panic of someone watching a carefully maintained image collapse in real time, in front of the exact audience she'd built that image for. This is not the place for this. This is Britt's wedding. You're all ruining her wedding. I ruined my own wedding, Britt said, very quietly, the moment I let this happen instead of stopping it. She sat down, then, at the head table, and I watched something in her finally give way, not the performance she'd maintained all evening, but something underneath it, years in the making. Julian set down the microphone. My mother stood in the middle of the ballroom, 200 guests watching, her carefully built narrative in pieces around her, and for the first time in my entire life, I watched her have nothing left to say. I took Caleb's hand. Come on, buddy, I said gently. We're going to go get ice cream. He looked up at me, still confused, still 5, and asked, Are you okay, Mommy? I am now, I told him, and for the first time all night, I meant it completely. Julian ended the wedding that same night, not legally, not yet, but in every way that mattered. He and Britt separated within the week. The marriage, which had lasted less than 4 hours in any meaningful sense, was annulled 2 months later. Britt moved back in with our parents temporarily, then, by autumn, into her own apartment, taking, for the first time in her adult life, a full-time job at a dental office rather than living off the wedding fund my parents had spent years accumulating for her. The video Hannah had recorded, not planned, just instinct, her phone already in her hand from Sam's screenshot, was uploaded by someone else at the wedding within 24 hours and reached, within a week, over 4 million views. My mother's carefully maintained image, built over decades of holiday photographs and performed warmth, cracked publicly in a way she has never fully recovered from. Old friends stopped calling. Her sister Denise, finally believed after 30 years, stopped attending family gatherings that included her entirely. My father reached out 3 weeks later, alone, without my mother's knowledge. He sat across from me at a diner and said, I should have said something that night. I should have said something 30 years ago, if I'm honest, when it happened to Denise. It wasn't enough. It was, at least, the first honest sentence I'd heard from him in longer than I could remember. I initiated full no contact with my mother the week after the wedding, and with my father, gentler contact, occasional calls, no promises. Britt and I talk sometimes now, carefully, the way people talk when they're deciding whether a relationship is worth rebuilding from something this broken. I don't know yet if it will be. I've stopped needing an immediate answer to that question. I think often about the group chat name, Voss Family, no Reagan, for words that told me, months before the wedding, everything I needed to know, if I'd let myself read them clearly the first time. I didn't, because reading them clearly meant admitting something about 33 years of my life that I wasn't ready to admit yet. I understand now that waiting cost me something, weeks of anxious nights, a wedding I attended already half knowing what was coming, but it also meant that when the truth finally surfaced, it surfaced in a room no one could spin, in front of witnesses who had no reason to protect my family's comfort over the plain fact of what had been done to me. I still work my shifts in the ER, still come home tired in the way that never fully leaves. But it's a different tired now, not the tired of holding up a version of my family that was never quite true, but the ordinary tired of a full life, raising Caleb, building something real with Colin, the pediatric nurse I'd known for years and started seeing, quietly, months after the wedding, once I'd stopped performing okayness and started actually feeling it. If you've ever been the person your family calls sensitive for noticing exactly what was happening to you, I think you already know most of what I've just told you. I don't know what my relationship with my mother looks like in 5 years. I know it will not look like it did before that ballroom, and I've made peace with that. I am not the woman who sat at table 23, smiling through a joke about her own life, anymore. I am someone with better boundaries, and a smaller, more honest family, one that no longer measures love by how quietly you're willing to disappear. If someone in your life has ever mistaken your patience for permission, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. One word is enough. And if you stayed with me and Caleb through all of this, thank you, genuinely, for sitting with our story the way I once wished someone had sat with mine. What's most unsettling about that ballroom isn't the joke itself, it's how many people laughed before they'd had a chance to decide whether it was actually funny. That's the real subject of this story, not one cruel mother, but an entire room's willingness to follow a script the moment it was handed to them. Look at the pattern across generations before assuming this began with Reagan. Colleen's humiliation of her own sister at Denise's wedding, 30 years earlier, wasn't a single bad night, it was a rehearsal, one that worked so well it became a private family blueprint, buried under decades of forgiveness that never asked to be earned. That's the part that reframes everything. Reagan wasn't unlucky enough to be targeted by something new. She inherited a pattern her aunt had already survived and never warned her about, because surviving it quietly was easier than naming it out loud. The real turning point of this story isn't the toast, it's the moment Julian stood up. Everything before that was Reagan absorbing damage, everything after it was damage finally being redirected toward the person who'd manufactured it. What makes that moment land isn't drama, it's timing. Julian had spent 2 years quietly gathering the same kind of evidence Reagan had, for entirely separate reasons, and the collision of those two private investigations, in front of an audience neither of them controlled, is what made the truth undeniable rather than dismissible. There's also something worth sitting with in Britt's specific failure, separate from her mother's calculated cruelty. Britt wasn't the architect of the humiliation, she was something more common and, in its way, more instructive, someone who recognized the harm in real time and chose the smaller, easier discomfort of going along with it over the larger, harder discomfort of standing against her own mother during her own wedding week. Her later admission, that she went along with it because she didn't want her mother upset with her, names something a lot of people recognize in themselves. Complicity rarely announces itself as cruelty. It usually just sounds like convenience. What lingers longest isn't the viral video, and it was never really about the audience size. It's the particular loneliness of being the family member whose reliability gets mistaken for a lack of feelings, and the quiet, unglamorous work of learning, at 33, in front of your own child, that dignity was never something you needed anyone else's permission to claim. Which leaves a harder question worth sitting with: how many of us have laughed along with something, even for just a few seconds, because the room around us made it feel safer to go along than to be the one person who didn't? What stays with me longest from Reagan's story isn't the confrontation, it's Caleb's question. "Mommy, why is everyone laughing at you?" Something a 5-year-old asks without any of the defenses adults build to avoid asking it themselves. I think a lot of us have laughed along at something, at some point, because the room made it feel easier than standing apart from it. I don't think that makes anyone a bad person. I think it makes us human, and I think the real measure isn't whether we ever laughed, it's whether we're willing to stop, once we understand what we were laughing at. If someone has ever made you feel like being patient meant you'd stop mattering, I'd love to hear about it below. One word is enough. A name. A moment. A joke you're still turning over. And if you made it this far with Reagan and Caleb, thank you for staying. Some stories are easier to carry once you know you weren't the only one who's lived a version of them.